Xanımlar və cənablar, hörmətli forum iştirakçıları, hörmətli media nümayəndələri, sizi Azərbaycan Respublikasının dövlət müstəqilliyinin 30-cu il dönümünə əsr olunmuş Azərbaycan Dövlət İqtisadi Universiteti tərəfindən təşkil olunan Zəfər Yolu adlı iqtisadi forumda salamlayırıq. 44 günlük vətən müharibəsində zəfər çalıb canından keçən bütün şəhidlərimizi bir dəqiqəlik sükutla yad edək. Allah rəhmət eləsin, igid əskərlər üçün ölüm yox, şəhidlik zirvəsi var. Hörmətli forum iştirakçıları, bir neçə saat öncə professor, biokimyaçı, Nobel mükafatı laureatı Aziz Sancarın gənc alimlərlə şəhid ailələrinin üzvləri və beynəlxalq elm olimpiyadalarının qalibləri olan şagirdlərlə görüşü keçirildi. Hörmətli forum iştirakçıları, indi isə İqtisadi Forum 1-ci panel müzakirəsi ilə davam edəcək. Açılış üçün söz verilir forumun sədri, UNEC-in rektoru professor Ədalət Muradova. Ədalət müəllim, buyurun.
Hörmətli qonaqlar, dəyərli həmkarlar, mən ilk növbədə hər birinizi bu möhtəşəm sarayda, eyni zamanda da sosial şəbəkələr vasitəsilə canlı olaraq bizləri izləyən çoxsaylı iştirakçıları və izləyiciləri salamlayıram. Azərbaycan Respublikasının İqtisadiyyat Nazirliyi, Azərbaycan Respublikasının Təhsil Nazirliyinin dəstəyi ilə UNEC İqtisadi Forumunda sizlərin hər birini salamlamaqdan qürur duyuram. Məlumat üçün bildirim ki, bu forum hər il keçiriləcək və onun ölkəmizin gələcək inkişafı baxımından əhəmiyyət kəsb edən məsələlərə müzakirə platformasına çevrilməsini hədəfləyirik. Azərbaycanın dövlət müstəqilliyinin bərpasının 30-cu il dönümünə həsr edilən bu forum həm qlobal, həm də milli müstəvidə çox böyük tarixi hadisə və proseslərin yaşandığı bir dövrə təsadüf edir. Hər şeydən öncə, Azərbaycan uzun illərdir həllini gözləyən ən böyük milli problemini həll etmiş, Qarabağı işğaldan azad etmişdir. 9 noyabr 20-ci ildə rəsmiləşən bu zəfər, Azərbaycanın və bütövlükdə Cənubi Qafqazın inkişafı üçün yaxşı mənada yeni perspektivlər açır. Müzəffər Ali Baş Komandan İlham Əliyevin rəhbərliyi ilə əldə edilmiş bu zəfər və Qarabağın yenidən qurma prosesinə misli görünməmiş sürətlə start verilməsi bir daha dünyanın diqqətini Azərbaycana, onun iqtisadi imkanlarına və iqtisadi qüdrətinə yönəltmişdir. Bu, həm də Cənubi Qafqazdakı inkişaf proseslərinin bir daha dünyanın diqqət mərkəzinə daxil olması deməkdir. Ona görə də forumu Zəfər Yolu başlığı altında keçirmək qərarına gəldik. Bu zəfər yolu təkcə Azərbaycanın deyil, bütövlükdə bölgəmizdə quruculuğa, inkişafa, sülhə və əmin-amanlığa səy göstərənlərin yoludur. Onların zəfəridir. Regionda haqq-nahaqqa qalib gəlmiş, beynəlxalq hüququn norma və prinsipləri bərpa edilmiş və ədalət zəfər çalmışdır. Qarabağı canı və qanı hesabına azad etmiş şəhidlərin ruhu qarşısında baş əyirəm. Eyni zamanda artıq 2 ilə yaxındır ki, dünyanı öz cənginə alan pandemiya həm özü ilə bərabər yeni sosial-iqtisadi problemlər gətirir, həm də uzun illər yığılıb qalmış problemləri daha da dərinləşdirir. Belə ki, ticarət müharibələri, qlobal dəyər zəncirində baş verən pozuntular, iqtisadi güc mərkəzlərində ortaya çıxan dəyişikliklər, yeniləşən qlobal iqtisadi sistemdə düzgün mövqe sistemini aktuallaşdırır. Qlobal İqlim dəyişikliyi, dərinləşən qlobal borc problemi, 4-cü sənaye inqilabı və bu çərçivədə baş verən rəqəmsallaşma qlobal iqtisadi artımı yeni və kifayət qədər də təcili çağırışlarla üz-üzə qoyur. Qlobal vaksin siyasəti, idarəetmə problemləri, gəlir və sərvət bərabərsizliyinin dərinləşməsi, sosial və iqtisadi imkanlara çıxışda qeyri-bərabərliyin artması, daha ədalətli iqtisadiyyatlar naminə daha adekvat siyasətlərin tətbiqini tələb edir. Rəqəmsallaşmanın sürətlə artması, iqtisadiyyatların rəqəmsal transformasiya prosesindəki qeyri-bərabərliklər, yüksək texnologiyalara əsaslanan istehsal ekosisteminin formalaşdırılması prosesində yaranan çətinliklər qlobal iqtisadi inkişaf paradigmalarında da köklü dəyişikliklərə gətirib çıxarır. Ölkələr arasında artan rəqəmsal uçurum bir növ gələcək və həm də daha dərin iqtisadi bərabərsizliyin də təməllərini atır. Bunun və ya digər məsələlərin Bütün bu və ya digər məsələlərin 3 gün ərzində forumun müxtəlif panellərində dünya miqyaslı alimlər və mütəxəssislər tərəfindən ətraflı müzakirəsi nəzərdə tutulmuşdur. Fürsətdən istifadə edib bizim dəvətimizi qəbul edərək foruma təşrif buyurmuş bütün qonaqları ürəkdən bir daha salamlayır və hər birinə dərin minnətdarlığımı bildirirəm. Bu forum çərçivəsində bizlərlə birgə olacaq Nobel mükafatı laureatı Əziz Sancar, Nobel mükafatı laureatı Muhammed Yunus, YÖK Başkanı Erol Özvər, Təhsil Naziri, Azərbaycanın Rəqəmsal Transformasiya və Nəqliyyat Naziri, Ekologiya Naziri, Kənd Təsərrüfatı Naziri hər birinə təşəkkür edir və xüsusilə qeyd etmək istəyirəm ki, Polşa iqtisadi islahatların başlıca memarı, iqtisad elmində yeni pragmatizm nəzəriyyəsinin müəllifi, keçmiş baş nazirin müavini və maliyyə naziri, 4 dəfə maliyyə naziri, bunu vurğulamalıyam, çalışmış professor Qjegoş Kalotkaya da təşəkkür edirəm. Ümid edirəm ki, forum faydalı müzakirələr, işgüzar tanışlıqlar və geniş təcrübə mübadiləsi baxımından bütün iştirakçılar üçün yadda qalan olacaq. Sözlərimi bitirərkən forumun təşkilində əməyi olan hər kəsə, o cümlədən təşkilat komitəsinin bütün üzvlərinə, tərəfdaş qurumlara, sponsorlara təşəkkür edir və forumu açıq elan edirəm. Diqqətinizə görə təşəkkür edirəm.
Təşəkkür edirik Ədalət müəllim. Panel müzakirə mövzusunu sizlərə təqdim edirik. Azərbaycanın gələcək inkişaf strategiyası, qlobal trendlər və yerli faktorlar. İndi isə birinci panel müzakirəsinin moderatoru və spikerlərini kürsüyə dəvət edirik. Neyman Muradlı, Azərbaycan Dövlət İqtisadi Universitetinin prorektoru, birinci panel müzakirəsinin moderatoru. Massimiliano Castel, UBS Bankının Strategiya Departamentinin rəhbəri, Gianvito Lanzola, Bayes Biznes Məktəbinin Strategiya və Rəqəmsal Transformasiya üzrə professoru, Gergos Kalotka, Kaziminski Universitetinin professoru, Yermolay Solzhenitsyn, McKinsey & Company'nin Moskvadakı baş tərəfdaşı.
Dear guest, I'm welcoming you to our forum, as already been explained by our rector, the purpose of the forum, the title of the forum, and I will briefly introduce our distinguished guest today. On my immediate left, we have Professor Kolotko. He's a distinguished professor. He served, as mentioned, several times as a Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister. He has over 150 scholarly articles and so many citations on those articles. He also currently is founder and head of Tiger Transformation, Integration, Globalization, and Economic Research in Kosminski University, Warsaw. And he has so many books, and the latest book he just authored is China and the Future of Globalization. And on our list, we have also Yermolay Solzhenitsyn. He's currently is a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. I must mention that he is also son of Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And currently he is also heading mining practices for Africa, Europe, Middle East, and CIS region at McKinsey. Before joining McKinsey, he spent several years working in China and Taiwan. And also, he used to be worked at World Bank in Washington as a consultant. Our third guest is Massimiliano Castelli. Castelli currently is heading strategy at the UBS Global Asset Management, and he has also several scholarly articles and the book, The Economics of Sovereign Wealth Funds. And he graduated from, he got PhD degree from University of Rome. Our fourth guest is John Vito Lanzola. He's currently a professor for strategy and digital transformation at Bias Business School, formerly Cost Business School. And he also served as a consultant in several Fortune 500 companies, including IBM, Allianz, and others. He's also, before joining to Bias Business School, he was a scholar at London Business School. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to give a stage on Mr. Professor Kolotko.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. So we are talking about globalization, but our meeting takes place in Azerbaijan. I can see behind you the Caspian Sea. My first comment is that everything is contextual. So when we are taking a look into the future, looking for an answer, what is to be done to improvement the standard of living of our people, which must be based on the ground of growing competitive in more knowledge-based economy. The question, of course, is always upon what it depends. In the morning, we had the privilege to listen to Professor Sanjar, Nobel Prize winner, and one of his advice was keep science out of politics and religion, and then keep politics and religion out of science. It's interesting, you know, because I'm a man of science. I was presented here mostly, basically as 4 times Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of my small, great country of Poland, not far away from here. But I came to politics because of my policy-oriented research. Is it science or not? It is a very good question, economics. I'm basically an economist because sometimes we hear the expression sciences and economics. So there are the sciences and there is economics. But economics is also a science trying to find an answer to explain how the things work in the social process of economic activities and being engaged in axiology, in the system of values, therefore in ideology. It's very difficult to depart politics altogether because economics is about solution to the conflict of interest, but also conflict of ideas. And the instant we start to talk about different ideas, what sense makes economic activity, what are the values, what are the priorities, what are the targets, we are talking about politics, and then it is very challenging issue as much as anything, any theoretical questions our colleagues, they do have in the science proper. So being involved in economic research, I was invited to join the politics and policies. And what are the lessons? What is the message? The things happen the way they do because many things happen at the same time. So when I'm taking a look, is it the United States in December of 2021, or small at the crossroad country like Azerbaijan? Is it big China or United Kingdom which left the European Union? Or is it my country or whatever? I'm taking a look first into geopolitics, next in history, which very much shapes the contemporary times and lay a shadow on the future, and then for comparative advantages, if any. Are we different? I remember when I was much younger than I am, I attended a conference at Columbia University in New York, and one of our great colleagues, an economist who unfortunately passed before he got the Nobel Prize, Rudy Donbur, said, "You are not different. You have to fix your exchange rate, you have to bring under control your public spending, you have to have a positive interest rate, you have to deregulate and privatize, and then the things will work." I listened to this smart guru of MIT, and I said, how wrong you are. We are different. There is one science of economics, but the conditions for economic activity are very different, and they depend. They depend what you have, and sometimes it is pretty good that you do have something like oil, but sometimes it is very bad that you have something like you have oil, because you may be under the curse of resources, and instead of diversifying an economy, you may give too much attention to exploitation of this or that resource, as we did for many of years in my country, that was coal, or as they do with copper in Chile, or with oil in Sudan, or in gas in Qatar, and so on. So having said so, let me make second big point, which is about globalization. There's plenty of debates about globalization. Somebody says that it is already gone with the winds, that it's already a melody of the past. Somebody says that globalization has been put under reverse. Somebody says about slowization and so on. My observation is first that pretty often there are the arguments because people, including the scholars, the students, the professionals, the technocrats, are using the same notion for different issues or processes, or by the same name, or call the same process by different names. So what is globalization? Globalization is a historical, longer than our lifetime, and spontaneous, if not chaotic, process of liberalization and integration of thus far separately to the extent performing national economies, like Azerbaijani, or businesses, into one interconnected, worldwide, global market. What happens here depends upon what has occurred elsewhere and is causing somewhere elsewhere. So we must be very careful, because globalization in this sense brings at the same time both new chance but also new risk. And therefore it is necessary to have a proper strategy for development, which must be based on a proper economic scientific reasoning, taking into advantage these new chances, especially international or global supply chain, free trade, flow of capital, but it is also a challenge or a risk, because capital can go elsewhere, because the foreign companies can drive our businesses in bankruptcy, in ruins. So we have to know how to manage on microeconomic level and how to lead economic policy on macroeconomic level to take these chances at the era of globalization to our advantage. And globalization, according to this definition, is irreversible. So if I was asked by President Aliyev what would be advice for Azerbaijan, I have not come here to give an advice. I come here to learn from your wisdom. I would say, first things first. First, you have to redefine the aim of economic activity and on your economic policy. It cannot be any more maximization of GDP, of gross domestic product, as it must be a more complex index of well-being, like, for instance, inequality-adjusted human development index or well-being index, taking into account also the social balance and dynamism, social cohesion, inequality, investment in human capital on the one hand, and ecological balance between us and Mother Nature on the other hand. Then I would say you have to know what are your comparative advantages and taking into advantage your resources to diversify the economy. Economy must be diversified in the specialized, but at the same time diversified from the structural viewpoint to find a niche where one can be competitive and take advantage of this irreversible globalization. And then, unfortunately, there is politics. I'm not sure how it is in Azerbaijani, Azeri language. In English, we say policy, but we say also politics. In my language of Polish, which is very funny, we have one word for both terms. But I mean that politics sometimes makes the things of macroeconomic management easier and sometimes makes it more difficult. So therefore, the dialectic, the feedback between policies and politics is of crucial importance. What is the lesson from Polish experience? My last point here for a country like Azerbaijan, it is that both the institutions, that is the rules of the game, friendly for business, for entrepreneurship, do matter, but so does the policies. And if one is able to take care of both at the same time, and one is knowing when one is aiming for, then one can be an author of a successful story. And from this perspective, I'm very positive about the future prospect of Azerbaijan, but it is not an easy task. It calls for a joint, smart, knowledge-based effort. Do remember, make no mistake, not only the economy should be based more and more on knowledge. I wish, maybe this is a kind of naivete or utopia, that also politics will be more based on knowledge and less on emotions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, I would like to give a stage to Mr. Yermolay Solzhenitsyn. Please, Mr. Solzhenitsyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, what an interesting time. What an interesting time to come together to discuss probably these somewhat eternal topics of how to organize ourselves, our communities, our people, our neighbors, to move forward. And to move forward on the one hand as a humankind, but also, of course, to move forward as economies, to move forward as communities. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what have we learned from this interesting last 2 years of this shock of COVID, what was new in this, and what was simply an acceleration of the trends we had before. So, some observations, and hopefully maybe we can have some exchange of opinions and not too many speeches. So one observation is when things happened so suddenly in January, February, March, April of 2020, I think many observers would note that multilateral institutions fell to the backstage. There was not many reactions to this virus, to this crisis from the UN, even from the World Health Organization, from the EU in Europe, from ASEAN in Asia. Immediately, nation states stepped up as actors. Moreover, in some nations, very quickly they said the situation is very different by region. So cities, governors are responsible for taking action. So one interesting moment was when crisis hit, mankind actually stepped back very close to localities. Second thought is, of course, globalization, as we know, is a pendulum. I think before World War I, people discussed that globalization is the only way to go. We should remove all tariffs. Protectionism is bad. There was this golden age of thinking about global trade. Between the two world wars, we know that mankind moved back to quite a lot of protectionism, quite a lot of competition. After World War II, there was this gradual move slowly until the 80s with, let's say, Reagan, Thatcher, Washington Consensus, where everybody said, the less state involvement, the better. The more government, the more free market, the better. Globalization is good. Comparative advantage of trade. Ricardo has taught us this in theory. This should work in practice. Privatization is always the answer. But one thing we all would agree, even before COVID, is globalization and global trade, while increasing the wealth stock of the planet, did not actually solve the problems of the wealth of many people or of incomes, and in fact, income disparities on the whole grew. And we saw in many countries the coming in political power of people who were actually talking about national interests before global interests. Donald Trump in America being the most obvious one. So globalization was already somewhat, if not in trouble, but being questioned as a mantra. And suddenly with COVID, all the borders closed. Supply chains closed, shipping closed. Okay, airplanes flew with cargo, but they did not flow with passengers. So we had this interesting second force of right away people thinking, wait a minute, global supply chains are dangerous. What happens if something, the world stops? The pandemic stopped it. What if there's a collapse of the internet, of digital communications? What happened if something else? So this was another reminder of the need to be strong locally. And finally, people sat at home. People sat at home together with their families. Some had good conditions for this, some had less good working conditions for this. But this also emphasized the point that actually the core of even the family and the house is something that's so central for the way we are organized. So these forces reminded us that while we sometimes get organized in very many intricate ways, in the end, sometimes life can very quickly throw us back to the local, core, individual, family cells of, let's say, existence, and even our houses are such an important thing. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind as we think about how we chart our way forward. Because these lessons will not immediately fall away, and countries will be very careful to open up again their borders to remove all of their tariffs. We see that China is actually saying, let us stay closed for another year. Because as many of you know, China's focus on economic growth for the next period is going to be domestic consumption driven. It is not going to be necessarily trade or export. The last decade, several decades was investment driven. They're making the emphasis on consumption driven. So this context is important. Now, as we think about, of course, the economic context, there's many economists also to come and speak. I will not duplicate them, but let's just remember what happened. Consumption fell in 2020 in the United States by 26%. In the UK by 26%. In the US by 11%. There was never such a decline of consumption except in wartime. Governments right away got very worried and they put in 16% of global GDP as cash or other infusions into the economy. Again, a massive infusion, nothing compared to what had happened before. But people didn't spend that money. Savings grew by 50% in Germany, by twice in the UK and the US. And now we all know what is happening. People are beginning to spend that money, and inflation is beginning to skyrocket. Governments are beginning to think about how we bring in interest rates to slow this down. And again, we're getting a situation where people are basically absorbing shocks from the outside, because a lot of this inflation is supply chain driven, a lot of this is global commodity volatility driven, and countries are really struggling to understand what to do. So this time, on the one hand, it's a pendulum, but it's a very, I don't think since the 1970s, colleagues will correct me, that this fear of stagflation has been around the planet, where we have basically lack of economic growth, potentially because people are not spending more, or the pandemic is happening, or because interest rates go up and people the economy slows down, and also the inflationary pressures. So these were the short-term effects. Now, what else do we all need to take into account? The climate. The climate, we all talk about this, we all know this, but can I just make one comment on this, that the volatility of what's going on in the weather is beginning to cost real money. So this is not only a commitment a noble cause of trying to get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. It is not only something that is the triumph, let's say, maybe of the younger generation, but for example, already we started seeing real losses in, heat waves in Europe in 2003, as long ago as that, $15 billion in losses. Australia, 8 years ago, $6 billion in productivity losses because of heat waves. South Africa had a drought a few years ago, 15% agriculture output decline. China flooding in 2017, $5 billion in direct economic loss. The Himalayan glaciers melting, this could reduce water supply to 250 million people. And there is estimates and modeling shows that by 2030 and by 2050, we may move to damages in the tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to infrastructure. This means that the new thing is we need to plan for emergencies better. So this is a new challenge. How do you get ready for emergencies? Technology and digital. We all, again, know these terms. Now, our modeling has shown that by 2030, not by 2050, by 2030, already hundreds of millions of jobs could be threatened by automation. I remember going somewhere in New York City or in America into a store only 3 or 4 years ago and being surprised for the first time to see the automatic checkout machine. I was quite also surprised, to be honest, in Moscow last week to see that at a local store. This spread of some professions are just going to disappear. Now, mankind has always lived through that. We know that in the 1830s, people were worried in England that, machines will replace hand weaving of carpets. And they did. But new professions arose, managing and building the machines. So this is inevitable, but again, it is accelerating. So what can we do? And finally, the social, and the colleagues have mentioned this already, the social stress is growing. I mentioned globalization has brought growth of inequality, not just between nations, within nations. And for example, one statistic, according to surveys, or not even according to modeling, in the 1950s, 95% of Americans, people born, let me restate it, of people who were born in the 1950s in America, 95% ended up being better off than their parents. This number has continued to decline to the level that where in 1985 people are born, only half are likely to be better off than their parents. And the other half are potentially going to be the same or even worse off. That is a massive political, social challenge, which exactly trumps the question of just GDP maximization. It talks about the increasing importance of integrating social factors and wealth distribution. So what are countries doing, and what should Azerbaijan do? Well, in the short term, countries, of course, as we said, threw money at consumers. They threw money at small and medium-sized enterprises, and they have begun large investment programs into infrastructure. Again, just some figures. Beijing is planning to invest in China until 2025, $2 trillion into new infrastructure. By the way, this new infrastructure is not just houses and bridges. They've built that before. They know this can create bubbles. Not all physical infrastructure like this is used. There's a lot of emphasis now on data centers, on 5G systems. The UK is planning to invest £100 billion per year, at least in 2022, on broadband, but also on traditional infrastructure, which is not as modern as the Chinese one, on rail, on roads, on cities. Also, the UK and many European nations are putting money into the green transition, investing into net zero approaches, through funds, through direct spending, through subsidies. Another direction is reskilling and teaching. For example, the Prime Minister in the UK introduced a lifetime skills guarantee. This is supposed to, and I don't know how detailed it is already, but the idea is to give people access to education and training they will need for all of their life. We cannot assume to plan about what skills will be needed in 2035 or 2040. And it's a very important shift from saying that I can always plan the future, and you know that our countries of Russia and Azerbaijan and Poland and others went through the period when we all thought that we could plan, have come to a situation where we can only create enablers and systems for people and the economy to respond to the challenges and opportunities that we don't even know today what they will be. But this emphasis on not just determining which skills we will need, but saying that we will always just have enough skill building capacity is an interesting idea. Of course, also innovation, new business building, startups, UK $2 billion program, $3 billion program for those who lost their work. So the story in the end, I would also maybe add the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates said, you know, we will put in a lot of money into research and development, into the green and digital, and they said that out of 2 trillion investments that they were planning to $2 trillion over 5 years, half will go into these new topics. By the way, also the Emirates said, look, we're going to make life very comfortable for people to interact with the state. We will digitize all services of the government to be accessible from anywhere, at any time, at people's personal devices by 2023. They appointed a head of digital for the government. Many countries do this because they really believe that this is one way you can really help people. So as we think about what to do in Azerbaijan, well, first of all, of course, we have to understand what do we think about oil. I think it's a false choice to say, is oil a curse or is oil an opportunity? Oil is a resource which is finite. Probably that is a good consensus. So probably you should use the oil while you have it. And as you know, the old saying that the Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of rocks, it is quite possible that the oil age will not end because oil ran out under the ground. We know that there's just debates about the peak moment, but this is a transitionary period. You probably need to think, do I need to define my new industries what are my competitive advantages? Well, I could say the following, a lot of countries these days say, I want to have IT clusters. I will have IT here. But what happened as people became more mobile, it's both a threat and an opportunity. People can work from a distance, which means that people, if they like to live in Azerbaijan, they will work here for your companies and for other companies. They will move from abroad here. But if they don't like to live in Azerbaijan, even your people will move away. So the fight to create an attractive environment for people, for young people, the fight to create a real middle class rather than just the very rich and the workers, the importance to invest in the main needs of man, education, health, safety, food. Politics probably comes after that. The importance to make that is how nations will compete. I, by the way, think it's hard to predict exactly which industry to work with and so on, but of course, probably you have more of a natural advantage in topics like agriculture, in areas like tourism, and potentially in some of the areas of logistics than maybe, in high tech or IT. I think also for countries that are not the major domestic markets, that are not huge economic superpowers, it is important to assume that while this anti-globalizing winds are in the air, creating partnerships and networks is very important. And it's a big difference, because globalization in its most radical form implies that everything will be produced there where it makes the most sense to produce it. But networks and partnerships, for me, implies much more being plugged in and connected in value chains, in the knowledge chains, in technology communities, probably a very important mindset for countries in your part of the world and of your size. And finally, one thing I would say is that culture and the new generation. Research has shown, our research has shown others, that up to 40% of employees, in response to the question, would you change your job, say, yes, maybe I will. Research shows that while 2 generations ago, people thought about lifetime employment, and the last generation, it was about 3 jobs during one's career on average. In the future, it could be as much as 5 or 7 different jobs in a person's professional career. People and the young people, probably in all generations, but it's certainly true today, do not want corporations. They do not want bureaucracy. People want to be flexible. They want to be their own bosses. And the ability to make your iconic companies, to make your best employers also modernize themselves, including your state-owned companies, to be less, let's say, ministerial, traditional, hierarchical, and let's say, not hurried, to be more flexible in how you pull in talent, to how you work with talent, to which models you allow. This will be an absolutely imperative way to compete going forward. These are some of the interesting issues I hope we can discuss during this forum, and thank you yet again for inviting to participate today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solzhenitsyn. You have just provided fantastic cases with strong statistical data. We appreciate for your speech. Before moving to next speaker, I must mention that Professor John Vito Lanzolo was planned actually to come to Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, due to high level of new infection in UK, government put some restrictions and he couldn't be able to visit Azerbaijan. But I would like to give stage to him. He also gonna make a very extensive presentation to us. Mr. Professor John Vito Lanzolo, please join us here.
For the introduction. Thank you also for the invitation. As you said, I mean, I was planning to be there. I was supposed to be there. Unfortunately, I cannot for logistical reasons. I mean, otherwise I would be to quarantine here in the UK. So I will be, I mean, after such esteemed colleagues, I will be focusing on a more, let's say, micro aspect of the topic of this panel. So I will be focusing specifically on the relationship between global digital trends and local factors. And what I will be saying today is I will basically try to discuss this point with you. So digitalization is a common theme. Everyone has been saying before me that digitalization is happening, good, bad, we don't know yet. But one thing that is often associated to digitalization is that digitalization might make the world flat. So give opportunities to everyone. Now, two things that come often with the concept of digitalization is all companies in the digital world will have a chance to do business in digital marketplaces. And another thing that is often associated to digital transformation or digitalization is that adopt digital technologies and good things will happen in your economy, in your company, in your organization. Now, what I will be challenging today is this prevailing view that digital transformation gives a chance to all companies and that just adopting digital technology is a kind of enabler of better and more fruitful futures. What I will be saying today is that in the digital world, local institutions matter, and perhaps matter even more than in the pre-digital world. And what I will be using to make this point in a specific way is two studies that I have done. So I have studied as a professor, I mean as an academic, and also advisor to governments and companies. So I have been studying digital marketplaces, okay? And digital marketplaces, and I have been grappling with the question, which companies get contacted in digital marketplaces? I mean, this is, just before me, they were discussing about this beautiful, or potentially beautiful world where people are mobile, they can move, and then so we can do business using digital technology. So the first thing that I want to discuss with you is, but is it true, or to what extent is it really true that companies in digital, that do business in digital marketplaces have a chance to do business with across the world, within the country and across the world? So the question is, so I am a seller in Azerbaijan. I am a seller in Baku. Can I find buyers just joining a digital marketplace? And but for the sheer fact that I am on this marketplace, I will find a buyer. Now, the situation, it's not that simple. I mean, the usual explanation for selecting a seller is that, I mean, when buyers look for a seller in digital marketplaces, they usually look at the seller brand, seller certifications, seller feedback, whether this seller has good or bad feedback from other clients. And then there is also an issue of buyer-seller geographical distance. There is a tendency, all else being equal, to choose sellers that are closer to home. Now, this is the theory, but the reality is that, I mean, in online digital marketplaces, there are hundreds or even thousands of sellers that have similar brands, similar level of certification, similar level of feedback, and even similar geographical distance. So in these marketplaces, why does a buyer end up selecting a company in Baku rather than in Frankfurt, rather than in London? So it's not just an issue of brand, certification, feedback, and geographical distance. What I show in my research is that, and this is the paper that I'm using, it's a paper published in Academy Management Journal, is what I show in my research is that companies, and I'm going to go straight to the point, this is based on a very broad study of buyer-seller interactions in digital marketplaces, okay? So with all industries are represented, so all geography are represented. So what I want to show here is that the seller institutional quality matter in a disproportionately high way in determining whether a seller gets contacted by a buyer or not. So I started this presentation by saying that digital on paper gives everyone a chance. What actually we are increasingly learning, and this research contributes to this learning, is that institutional quality of the seller matter in a disproportionately high way. All this fancy star or asterisk basically means that it is incredibly important where the seller is located and what is the perceived institutional quality of the seller that a buyer wants to do business with. It's even more important, and I want to add that if a seller sees himself or herself in a higher position institutionally vis-a-vis if a buyer sees himself or herself vis-a-vis a higher institutional environment vis-a-vis the seller, they even ask for more institutional quality. I'm basically saying here that despite what we might think that digital marketplaces level up everything, what this research shows and what increasingly research shows is that the seller that they wants to do business must be in environments that are perceived as having high institutional quality, because otherwise buyers don't even contact you. And so who are the winners? Who are the winners in the digital marketplaces? The winners are, perhaps not surprisingly, companies that are in regions that are perceived as having high judicial efficiency and high predictability and dependability in contract enforcement, and companies, sellers that are in regions with very low level of corruption and organized crime. Let me give you an example from my home country, which, I'm a professor at London at the Base Business School, previously at London Business School, but now my home country is Italy. So this basically means that company in the region of in Milan, okay, in the north, which is perceived to be to have a very high institutional quality, so much more efficient tribunals, much more dependable contract enforcement, much lower corruption. This company in Milan, all else being equal, has a much higher likelihood to be contacted than a company in the south where this assumption don't hold true. Now, this is something that perhaps it's not always so easily, let's say, understood in its implication. Because what this basically means is that digital, in the end, will be amplifying already the existing baseline behaviors of buyers and sellers. It's not leveling at all. It's actually even worse. If you are in a disadvantaged region, you risk to be disadvantaged even more. So this is a call for policymakers to make sure that, at least the institutional quality comes back as at the forehand of the agenda, because otherwise the companies that are in that region will not even be able to play the game in the digital world. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. Digital doesn't level up. Digital institutions matter, specifically these institutions matter, perhaps matter even more. So if Azerbaijan or any other country wants to create a level playing field for companies, they should be looking at this specific dimension of institutions. Another thing that it comes often with the digitalization and digital transformation is that, okay, adopt digital technologies, join ecosystem, change your business model, and things will happen. You will become a better bank. You will become more efficient. More customers will come to you. Now, I don't want to oversimplify, but what basically my research shows is that this is another oversimplification. So for policymakers and businessmen in the audience, digital technology adoption is just the beginning. But what, for example, I show, and there is increasing evidence, is that I'm going to just spend a few seconds on this graph, which might look like esoteric, but basically what it says is that on the horizontal axis, there is the time from digital technology adoption to use of that technology. The duration is in weeks. And on the vertical axis, there is the likelihood that the people in the company use that technology, okay? You can see very quickly that many technologies basically never get used. So the likelihood of using digital technology by a sample of users in your company is already relatively low, but it drops to negligible after a few weeks. So this is just to give an intuition that adopting many governments push for technology adoption. But actually the problem is not that much adoption, it's actually the use of that technology to really change the business model and become more efficient, more innovative, or whatever is the strategic case for adopting digital technology. So the point that I will be making today is that policymakers and businessmen should not necessarily focus on adoption. Adoption is a precondition, but they need to focus on use. And what drives use? Now, besides all the esoteric things that you see here, what drives use is, of course, HR policy within the organization, which is something that we cannot control at the policy level, we can only control at the business level, but there is something that we can control at the policy level or at institutional level, which is basically creating user bandwagon. So what is increasingly clear is that users of digital technology don't listen that much to their top management. In fact, I'll show you now, it's actually the top management has even a negative effect on usage, okay? So if the top management says use a technology, usually that doesn't work. What works much better to shrink the time from technology adoption to technology use is making sure that other users speak with the users in your company to say, listen, this digital technology really matters, so this will make a difference. Invest the time, the reskilling that is needed, because otherwise you will be selected out from the market. So the point that I'm making here is that often there is if you want, an equation or an intuition that to enable the digital transformation, to enable the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, there are plenty of concepts that are related, even if not exactly the same. It's enough to trigger technology adoption. What actually it happens is that technology adoption can be completely irrelevant if it's not accompanied by bandwagons of users. So social dynamics. What I'm claiming here is that you need not only to create the condition for adopting the technology, but also influence the society, social dynamics, because users of the technology influence other users by location, by industry, by type of company, and they impact the use of the technology even more than the top management teams. Users don't trust top management teams as much as they trust other users. So the 2 points that I have been making today is that we started with the economy 2.0, or everything will change. Perhaps we are back to square one. The point that I wanted to make is that digitalization is a global phenomenon. We can like it or not. That's not for me to discuss. But one thing that I wanted to say today is that to embrace digitalization and give companies a chance in Azerbaijan, like in the UK, like in Russia, or anywhere else in the world, institutional quality, so corruption, judicial system, so very old economic constructs matter perhaps even more than in the past, because otherwise buyers don't even look at you, and so you are systematically selected out from global trade and global business. And social dynamics are the ones that we should also pay attention to if we want to really drive change, digital transformation in companies in Azerbaijan or everywhere else. It's not enough to foster adoption. It's not enough to have, if you allow me, forum where top managers and top executives and policymakers speak to one another, they learn about the need for adopting. It's actually perhaps more painful, but perhaps as effective in driving the change in the economy, creating social bandwagons. So we need to enable not necessarily only adoption, but also the usage. And this has let's say, some policy implications which are very clear, because usage then, of course, it's by location, by industry, and also by firm side. So these were the 2 points that I wanted to make today. Digital is there to stay, but going forward, local institution will be even more important to make a difference in the digital world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lanzola. So far, you have heard that from, we have talked from macroeconomic side, and on behalf of Mr. Lanzola also talked focused on more micro side. And now we're gonna just, move to the next and last speaker, Massimiliano Castelli, and I believe he will provide us information. Economic information, of course, but from a more finance side. Massimiliano Castelli, thank you very much for joining us here. Please have it to speak now.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me and see me well. You will forgive me if I am rejected, because I was actually rejected a few times and I have to reconnect. So if that happens, please bear with me, because I will reconnect very quickly. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for the kind invitation, and of course apologize as well myself for not being in Baku. Actually, it was quite a while ago, before the pandemic, that I was in that beautiful city. I travel regularly to Baku at least twice a year, because as UBS we have the pleasure of working in partnership with some important institution in your country, and it happens very often for me to visit that country. So say that, what I would like to do in the next 15 minutes is just to maybe go a little bit deeper on the sort of a macro and the structural trends that we are seeing at a global level, and try to extrapolate from that some strategic implication for Azerbaijan as it prepares for the post-pandemic era. Let me first of all start by sharing a slide, which is a survey that I carry out, my team carry out in June of this year. So this was actually at the peak, if you want, of the previous wave of the pandemic. And we ask basically to an institution from all around the world, what are your major concerns with regards to the global economy? And actually, not surprising, 80%, so the top concern remain, and it was at the time, and I believe it would be the same now, even more, that we have a new variant hitting us, that the failure to control the pandemic. What I think, however, is more interesting is what are the concerns which are in second and third position. First of all is about the government debt level. That's something that you heard from the previous speaker, that the reaction of government to the pandemic has been to inject an unprecedented amount of expenditure, of fiscal expenditure into the economy, or directly into the pockets of individuals or in the balance sheet of companies. And of course, this has ballooned the deficit, the debt level of countries. That's something that so far has not been really discussed very much, in the sense that we are still dealing with an emergency. I guess that's what happened when you are still in an emergency. You think about, first of all, to extinguish the fire, and then you think about repairing the damage a little bit later. So I'm not surprised about that. But just to mention that this, at least from an institutional investor perspective, is a source of concern. The other one is about inflation. And now this is interesting, because we ask this survey every year. Believe me, inflation until this year was not mentioned by anyone as a concern. Actually, the major concern in the past used to be deflation and the problem of not being able to hit the inflation target which central banks have. So that's definitely a new debt and inflation are two new reasons of concern at the global level, which were not present at all in previous years. This is a very important factor, because I believe that once this pandemic will be behind us, will become prominent. Actually, inflation already is, and I think that will also be a very important topic of conversation among the policymakers. Now, then if you look at the other factors, I think we have exactly what you would expect, the geopolitical issues. The main one, of course, is the China-US relationship and eventual escalation in that confrontation. And the fourth one, which was already mentioned by some of the previous speakers, by Mr. Solzhenitsyn, actually was climate change and all the potential implication that this will have on the global economy going forward. Now, these are, in a nutshell, what comes out of these surveys, that there are some important change occurring as a result of the pandemic, which in the end will remain there once the health emergency is over. So before I go back to these sort of more long-term issues, which I believe are very important for any country looking at how to position itself competitively in the global economy going forward, let me just mention very quickly what happened. And I will be relatively brief here, because my previous speaker already mentioned some of the factors which are very important. First of all is that it's true, we are in the middle of a new wave We have a new variant which is still obscure in terms of potential real implication going forward. But for sure, there is a fact that the recovery is strong. The recovery is ongoing. We see expansion across both the manufacturing sector, but more importantly, more in the service sector, which of course was the one which was impacted very heavily during the lockdown. So what happened is very simple. As the lockdown were introduced around the world and social mobility dropped, the people, at least those who continue receiving an income or who receive additional income via transfer from the government, have been largely spending time on buying goods, durable goods. And in fact, we have seen a very big demand increase in the manufacturing sector, which has actually come probably even stronger than what we were expecting during the pandemic. Now, this effect is very important because this has been what ultimately has also driven up inflation. Because, of course, with a sudden increase of pent-up demand into sectors which have a limited production capacity, we saw prices soaring in a specific sector. We saw bottleneck emerging on the supply side. We saw as well, very important for a country like Azerbaijan, the rise in oil price as well. Now, that's a little bit, then in the second wave, when social lockdowns, when social mobility is starting to resume in terms of intensity and going back gradually to the pre-pandemic level, to the pre-lockdown level, actually we are seeing that the demand is gradually shifting from the manufacturing sector towards the service sector. Now, this is a very important dynamic because you will hear from me, I am a banker, you will hear from the majority of the financial service industry, but I believe as well from central banker, and I'm talking about the central banks who dictate the monetary policy, so the Fed, the ECB, and other central banks in the developed world, that the current increase in inflation is transitory. And this view about the transitory increase in inflation is largely due to what I told you before, that the social mobility restriction have created an imbalance between demand and supply, which eventually, through time, will be reabsorbed and will bring back the inflation towards the target of around 2.5%, which is what is considered as sustainable over the long term. Now, of course, if this is going to be the case, I believe remains to be seen. I am personally as well in the camp of those who believe that there is no real scenario of stagflation, in the sense that in order to have a scenario of stagflation, we should see some important development, for instance, in the labor market. But say that there is some important difference across countries. For instance, we are starting to see some interesting developments in the labor market in the US, where actually the participation rate appears to be dropped during the pandemic and is not coming back. Some, I believe it was even as well McKinsey that we're talking about the great resignation. And I think that overall this, of course, points to potential bottlenecks in the labor market, which could eventually have an impact if of course, start pushing up wages. I believe this is mainly a feature in the US, but that's definitely a factor to watch as we move into the post-pandemic world. Now, one factor which for banks and in general for investors is very important is that, seen from an historical perspective, the level of interest rate remain incredibly low. Yes, it is true that eventually the central banks will be forced maybe to hike rates a little bit earlier than what was forecasted just a few quarters ago, for instance, the Fed in the course of 2022. It is true that there is some pressure on central banks to start reducing their buying of bonds in the open market, so the so-called quantitative easing. But if you look at overall the monetary policy stance that we have across the major economies, I'm not talking about mainly developed market economies, it is still very, very, very loose. And this is, of course, very, very important because this guarantee that there is an ample level of liquidity which supports the economy and continues supporting the economy. That's a very important element. Now, what about emerging markets? I mean, emerging markets, it is very important because emerging markets came into this crisis in a position of strength, particularly when you think about Asia. Asia was the one which were able to control the pandemic better than anybody else. They had a very low level of contagion. They were able to impose a very strict social measure. The level of mortality was very low. Overall, China was very successful as well, and it is indeed. But what actually made a difference, what has made a difference over the course of 2021, it is the level of vaccination rate across developed market and emerging economies. Now, you see here the difference between emerging markets, which are in red, excluding China. China, as you know, is also vaccinated at a very rapid pace. And you also see that most of the Western world is around well above 50%, 60%, and in some cases also closer to 80%. Now, what's very important to keep in mind is that the emerging markets are catching up very quickly. That's also, of course, a result of the fact that vaccines are becoming more widely available across more jurisdictions. And I think that's also, we think that ultimately emerging markets will eventually catch up in terms of economic performance. Some of them are already catching up pretty strongly, particularly the commodity-based one, because of course the rise in commodity price in oil, but also in other commodities, which we experienced in 2021, has been pretty robust, and it is of course helping a lot some of these economies to recoup very quickly what they lost during the pandemic. So let me stop here about the sort of more economic outlook perspective by saying that we have a very strong economic recovery in place. We have definitely an improvement in the situation. Yes, it's true, we are still seeing the pandemic hitting, and there is of course a question mark about the variante, but if this variante will not be a game changer, it is reasonable to assume that the level of social mobility will remain relatively good as we move in 2022, and this recovery can continue as the expansion moves from the manufacturing sector to the service sector, which ultimately represent the bulk of the majority of the economies. Now, of course, there are risk factors out there. One of them for sure is inflation, but also if I look at the perspective from an emerging market point of view, actually, if you think about it, the recent announcement made by the Fed about a reduction in their purchase of bonds in the open market, the so-called taper tantrum, has actually had a relatively limited impact on emerging market. Last but not least, let me mention that I operate a lot within emerging market. Emerging markets have been very reactive in increasing interest rate in the face of the rise in inflation, probably on the back of the fact that emerging markets are more weak in general from a macroeconomic perspective, and they want to take preventive measure. They're not prepared to take the gamble of seeing whether the inflation is temporary or not. They simply start hiking rates, and we saw that across the board from Russia to Brazil to over several economies, for instance, in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, if I move down to the question which I believe it is more important, so which is about the long term, because I think ultimately what I think will determine the success or failure, let's say the winner and the loser in the post-pandemic world, will be how countries will focus on those factors of competitiveness which we think will drive growth in the future. So if I look at the way that what are the sort of big trends, the secular trends that are reshaping the global economy, some of them have already been mentioned, but let me just go a little bit more in detail on that. First of all, I mentioned to you that it's going to be a world which is more in depth. That's very important to keep in mind, because this will create some issues. It will create some debate about how to put under control the fiscal situation of countries. Let me also mention that, for instance, in the case of Azerbaijan, which correctly has expanded its fiscal policy, has suspended the fiscal rule during the pandemic, eventually will be very important as well to eventually go back to a sustainable fiscal path, because of course on that depends macroeconomic stability. But there will also be countries which will not be able or will not succeed in doing that. And these are countries which will fail on the macroeconomic stability level, which of course it is the sort of condition sine qua non for having a healthy growth in any country. That's very important to keep in mind, because that will determine as well who is going to do well, who is not going to do well in terms of growth going forward. Now, the second factor that I think it is already been mentioned, and I'm really glad about my Italian fellow panelists talking about digitization. I found this presentation incredibly interesting. I think what, if I can, I hope Gianvito will forgive me if I say that what he said is very important. Digitization is in front of us everywhere. It is from our online shopping to the way we use money, digital currency, everything is happening. But there is still a lot of, it's not clear how all these trends are going to impact different countries, different sectors, and different corporates. So this is something which is going to be very, very important going forward to understand. But what is certain is that we are at the beginning, I believe, of a major trend which has the potential to reshape many sectors. And I will mention one of them, which of course is more closer to my knowledge and to my heart, which is the digitization that we are witnessing in the financial service industry. Now, another important element that has not been mentioned, but that I would like to mention, is about the inequality. This is something which I think it is also very important to keep in mind for two reasons. First of all, for an ethical reason, the loser needs to be bailed out. We learned that through the pandemic, and they cannot be left behind for a simple reason that if that happens, ultimately this will have a very strong political repercussion. But that's not all the whole story. There is also an economic dimension to inequality, which we believe it is also the source of some important distortion. Just think about, for instance, the growing empirical evidence which has been released by academics around the world for the role that inequality and the concentration of wealth is having, for instance, on the level of interest rates. So there is something that also central banks are starting to consider in their monetary policy framework. Then let me mention something which has been mentioned, and I'm very glad about Professor Kolodko's comments on globalization, which has been made. I remember about 2 years ago, I published a paper together with a colleague from, an academic from IMD about globalization. And definitely the feeling is that we are entering a period of slowdown in globalization, and according to some, we are going to see even a reversal. Now, how does this match the sort of massive rise in international trade, in shipping goods being moving across ships in the world? Containers are at the max, and actually we're seeing bottleneck emerging in ports. I believe that the story about globalization or deglobalization is going to be a little bit more complicated than simply a drop into sort of a reversal, for instance, in the growth of international trades or in terms of global capital flow, including foreign direct investment, maybe even immigration, which of course has been impacted very heavily from the pandemic already. But that's something that I think is very important to keep in mind, because I believe that one potential important implication of this new phase of globalization will be about risk diversification in international value chain. So basically the idea that being reliant only on China for the production of your semi-industrial goods, it is a risky business, because who knows how things will develop, for instance, in the confrontation between US and China, with protectionism always potentially there, being used as a political tool in this geopolitical competition, which will remain a feature of our life, at least for the foreseeable future. So from that point of view, I believe this also opens some opportunities for countries which are able to attract maybe some investment which are being directed at different countries. We're already seeing that strategy being deployed by some countries. Example, Vietnam. Example, Mexico, which is offering the US, well, you want to be less dependent on China? Well, you can come and invest here, just across the border. And that's, of course, something that they are looking very closely by adopting strategy clearly focused on that. Then there is a fifth one, which is about sustainability. Now, sustainability has been mentioned by my previous speaker. I believe I am a little bit more sanguine about sustainability, because we believe that sustainability is a transformational trend. It is, of course, we can debate about the speed and the timing of this transition. It can be longer or shorter. I think it depends on a lot of variables, including to what extent the weather event will become more extreme relatively quickly rather than later, or whether politicians ultimately will respond to the demand coming from people and citizens around the world and will accelerate and take more courageous measures in terms of really moving the world away from carbon type of fuel. But that's for us a trend which is there. And I think for a country like Azerbaijan, like for any other country which is oil commodity based, it should eventually be taken very seriously, because ultimately this could be the trend that will determine success or failure going forward. And I think it is very wise to eventually already think strategically about this. So let me, I got maybe a few minutes left. I would like to talk about two things. First of all, globalization. Now, this is a very interesting topic, because until a while ago, I was pretty convinced that the world was moving towards a multipolar system. As protectionism and barriers are raised across from China versus the US and vice versa, I could see the world shifting to three main blocks. The America centered around the US dollar, the EU, of course, the Europe centered around the euro, and of course the Asian centered around China and the RMB. And actually we are starting to see already a little bit of that. At least if I look at it from a financial perspective, from an investment perspective, the more I talk to clients who invest, who have a global portfolio, they tend to really have the US, the Euro area, Europe, and China, and then the others. And I think that's something very, very important, because that's a new development. We are starting to see, for instance, investors taking China out of the emerging market universe, because China is so big in terms of both this fixed income market and in terms of its equity market, that ultimately makes sense to have China as a separate allocation in your global portfolio. This is something very remarkable, because it means that really the world is moving towards this multipolar system. Now, this was my conviction until a while ago, and I can see all the different sort of, if you want, the different ingredients supporting the view. We were seeing a much more inward looking from different countries. China protecting certain sector, the US and Europe focus on strategic sector, think about health sector, semiconductors, what sometimes they are labeled as a strategic asset from an industrial perspective. And then, of course, there was the policy drive, protectionism from the US towards China, Europe as well, creating a more control at this border. But overall, I think that there is a factor which could in some way change the cards and change this shift towards the three main blocks, which is technology and digitization. Because it is true, as Gianvito said, that ultimately it is not enough to become digital to be successful. You need to support that digitization with a very solid institutional framework. But the point is that a country with a very solid institutional framework, but relatively small, both in terms of its economy, in terms of its population, and in terms of the weight that it can have in the global economy, before digitization did not have any chance in some way to emerge or to really come out as a potential competitor with the largest economy. What if instead the digitization can change that level of competition? I give an example, which I think it is a fair example, which is about the digital currency. We are seeing an amazing acceleration in central banks' activity around central banks' digital currency. It is clearly foreseeable that over the next 5 years, and maybe a little bit more depending on the speed, but I believe we're not talking about something very, very distant in time, we are going to see digital currency replacing a fiat currency. Now, this is very, very important, because the rise of digital currency, supported by a solid institutional and macro framework, can make a currency which before did not have any chance to succeed to eventually become very attractive. And this is very important, because this means that those countries which will be able to embrace digitization, to be and support this process with a solid economic, macroeconomic, fiscal and monetary policy framework, and the right investment in infrastructure and human capital, has the potential to thrive in this new global digital world. And I think that that's something that should be part of any blueprint of a strategic plan of a country moving into the post-pandemic world. I would like to end with the question which, as I mentioned, is very important for Azerbaijan. I always find myself in conversation with commodity-based sovereign wealth funds. I know very well Azerbaijan. I'm very familiar with all the commodity-based sovereign wealth funds across the Gulf. And I believe that, we are part of the One Planet initiative, which is the most emblematic initiative of sovereign wealth funds really focusing on climate change and eventually to incorporate climate change in their investment framework. And I believe, and here we have some of the big guys from the Gulf, the Saudi, the UAE, ADIA, or the KIA from Kuwait. These are the most well-established sovereign wealth funds. So what happened with climate change? What is the story? Should the role of this sovereign wealth fund change? Well, I believe that sovereign wealth funds in the post-pandemic world, the more digital and green type of world that we're moving in, will have to play a even more important strategic role. In the sense that the sovereign wealth funds have been fundamentally created to diversify accumulated oil revenues in global market, to maximize the return on that wealth, and eventually to transmit part of the wealth to future generations. Now, as we move into an energy transition type of world, which of course will take a while to materialize, but I believe it will continue, sovereign wealth funds will have to play an additional role. They will have, first of all, be part of the strategic shift of any country's oil-based country to diversify its economy away from oil. Very often, sovereign wealth funds have the most sophisticated personnel. They know very well financial market. They can handle strategic investment, sometimes better than other entity in the country. But secondly, they will also have a very big responsibility down the road from a fiscal perspective, should the government eventually, in a world where revenues will fall, start to eventually needing some funds. So on that level, let me also add that the sovereign wealth funds can also play a very important role as far as green technology is involved. Why not sovereign wealth funds in an oil exporting economy should not invest, for instance, much more heavily in carbon capture or any green technology, which in the end will be a very important part of the energy transition going forward. I believe that all these strategic choices should start to be considered relatively quickly, relatively sooner rather than later, because it is true that some of these trends will take years to unfold, but ultimately, the those who prepare now and will lay the ground for being competitive in 10 years' time, I believe will ultimately succeed. With that, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castelli. Now I would like just to turn to audience. If you have any just question right now, you may ask. Do we have any question from the audience? If not, that's a good opportunity to me. I have lots of questions actually. I'm going to ask. First, I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Solzhenitsyn, since he has a very tight schedule. I know that he must leave soon. So, Mr. Solzhenitsyn, you have just touched upon so many points there, but the one point I'm very interested actually these days, we are seeing that the big organizations, big corporations are getting bigger and bigger, right? I mean, we have seen that some companies already, the valuation is going over $2 trillion. Don't you think that those organizations are hampering competition and thus innovation as well? Because we have seen huge M&A very recently, and don't you think that those organizations are eating small fish, let's say, in a financial jargon, and thus we have, because historically we have seen that more innovation came from small and medium organizations. What's your opinion on that field?
The answer is probably very different by industry, by country, by market, but probably some thoughts. First of all, I would disagree. The big companies, the giants, are all the IT and technology players. Today, this is Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Alibaba in China, a few other Chinese. I think it's pretty clear that actually these companies have created a lot of additional productivity gains. whether it is for consumers and B2C interactions, or whether it is in even for businesses. So I think that, to be honest, I'm not sure it's a true claim that innovation is coming from smaller companies. I think some of these giant technical companies are succeeding. Second is, you see in the mining and energy space, I think actually sometimes a trend to separating out different business units, not to be penalized by markets' somewhat skeptical view of the old economy, so to speak. We see already, even 5 years ago, companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, or BHP, for example, separating coal out of its portfolio. We see a lot of the energy companies separating the oil separate from some of the directing capital to renewables. So in some ways, it's even creating more players, maybe with more focus. Of course, it is true that some of these huge corporations are now commanding markets that are bigger than countries. So we definitely need to think well about what this could mean to society, but it seems to me that so far they have brought much more good than barriers to progress.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your response. And now I wanted to turn to Professor Kolotko. You have extensively talked and wrote so many papers and books as well about globalization. And very recently we are seeing that there is a supply chain disruption actually in the world, right? I mean, due to, of course, the major part is because of COVID. And these days, China and US, we have witnessed during the Trump administration, there was a huge kind of a conflict. We were expecting that conflict is not resolved under Biden administration, but unfortunately it wasn't. Don't you think that, this is going to be deglobalization? Is this going to be increased deglobalization? Because, recently we are seeing that US still is just, putting some restriction on Chinese companies like, Huawei and other companies under certain conditions. What's your opinion about, do you think, my question is that, do you think that this kind of acts is going to increase a deglobalization rather than globalization?
Not at all. Not at all. Globalization is irreversible. Again, make no mistake, globalization is irreversible unless you change the definition. I shared my definition. This is the historical and spontaneous process of liberalization and integration of thus far performing to the extent separately markets, national economies, of goods, capital, portfolio and direct investments, technology, know-how, and with delay and constraints also for non-economic, political, and cultural reasons, labor, into one interconnected worldwide global economy. Period. Second, how to measure it? Most often by trade against GDP or capital flow against GDP and so on. So therefore, third, do we have less of globalization, say, in 2021 than, say, in 2018 or 2005? Definitely less than in 2015 because of one policy mistake, and the most severe mistake of democracy in our lifetime, that is the election of Mr. Trump for the President of the United States. And second, just a case, pandemic. Of course, it slows globalization for the time being. Trump is gone. Well, the shadow of his mistakes is still with us. Pandemic will be gone. Well, the shadows of pandemic will be with us maybe for a lifetime. But the power of globalization, the supply chains, the free trade, the flow of the capital, and the cultural factor is so strong that neither the xenophobia, nationalism, chauvinism, protectionism, ill-advised economic theories, and stupid politics are not able to break the core of ongoing globalization. You are talking about not globalization, you are talking about Chimerica, two most powerful economies of the world. Yes, They make the most important impact on what is going in the world. For the time being, very big surprise for me, the continuation of ill-advised Cold War, trade war by President Biden. He follows here from this perspective. Fortunately, not from the perspective, for instance, for fighting the climate or inequality, the line which was enforced by Mr. Trump when he was in White House, this xenophobia. Yes, xenophobia, Russophobia, depends where you are. I said that everything is contextual. In my country of Poland, for instance, xenophobia, Russophobia is much stronger a factor, a negative one, than xenophobia. We did not allow it to be manipulated by the United States towards xenophobia in Poland as in some other countries. It will be gone because it is against business, it is against common sense, it is against, balanced, sustainable development. So they must come to the conclusion. And sometimes we have a good hint. On the eve of conclusion of COP26 in Glasgow, there was an agreement between China and America what to make a contribution like to the communique of this climate change conference. And as far as we are talking business, entrepreneurship, trade, there is very few American firms which are in favor of this xenophobic approach, etc. They are looking for the time when it will be just music of the past. So it is making the ongoing globalization more difficult, but I think it's just a friction. It's just a friction. We have to take a look, not what is going to be in 2022 or 2024, but what will be the fourth and the fifth decade of this century, and there will be the more of globalization. And from this perspective, each and every country, each and every business must ask him or her the question, what are the implications for my strategy, my business, my entrepreneurship, my policy, and so on. For some of them, not at all. But for most of us, from macro and microeconomic viewpoint, they are the implications. So we have to stay calm. We have to argue. I mean, we, the people of academia, the people of business, the people of common sense, to calm down this political atmosphere, which is very unfavorable. We do have the second Cold War. And this Cold War has been declared by United States against China, first of all, but also against Russia and some other countries. And now the country like Azerbaijan or Poland, we are in between. When I was going here from the hotel, I met in elevator right here, a handsome man in the uniform, Royal Army, British. I asked, what you are doing here? Oh, I'm training Azerbaijani army. I would feel better if he was in civil suit and he would say, I'm teaching the students at the Economic University of Business Management at the era of digitalization. That is where we do need much more, exchange. But we are being involved by the rich and the powerful of this world in this Cold War and in this trade war. And this is not the reverse of the course of history, because the course of history is going to better work. Am I sure? I'm only sure that today is 1st of December and I'm in Baku. That is what I'm sure for 100%. But everything else, as the future is concerned, is an assumption. But this is the assumption based on the best of my professional knowledge, not on my belief. I'm talking science, social sciences, not a religion. So globalization is irreversible, and the wrong elements in the policies of US, China, if you wish, small countries like Azerbaijan or Poland, if they are the wrong elements, wrong points, they will be just wiped out because the common sense, rationality will take over. The globalization became recently irrational, but not because the nature of globalization, according to this definition, because it's been too much globalization according to neoliberal ideology and a neoliberal economic train of thought. So we have to move toward more inclusive globalization out of extractive globalization. And this Cold War, this trade war are an instrument to continue extractive globalization, which is enriching the few at the cost of many. You need knowledge and you need courage to fight this extractive globalization, and do not accept that this is the end of globalization, because that would be the most severe mistake.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your extensive response. And my last question is going to be actually to both authors, both scholars, I mean, so for Mr. Castelli and for Professor Lanzola. Well, both of you are just specialists in digitalization, actually. And in one part of digitalization, of course, the digitalization is a comprehensive, you know, the idea, let's say. And one part, an important part, comes as an artificial intelligence, right? You know, we are reading so many information about artificial intelligence. A year ago, for example, I have read that a certain company wrote a certain program between computers, and at some point, those two computers start to connect with each other, which humans didn't understand actually what they are doing there. And many scholars, I have heard that, put importance to that factor. The artificial intelligence is getting dangerous actually in some. And on the other hand, artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies, well, many authors, again, assuming that it's gonna to increase unemployment rate, because many kind of, jobs that doesn't require skills is gonna be compensated by, robotics and other things. From macroeconomic and microeconomic point of view, what's your opinion about this, this technological advances? Do you think that advances are always good, or there are some, negative side as well? Professor Lanzo, let's start with you.
So thank you for the question. So artificial, like everything else, technology has agency. So which basically means, in very practical terms, it's not technology per se, but it's the use of the technology that determines its real impact and effects. Artificial intelligence has some specific issues which are related to what I think you hinted is black boxing, and also the fact that there is it's very difficult to explain the pattern of learning. There are some very specific issues related to artificial intelligence. Again, as also my colleagues were saying, we cannot stop artificial intelligence. We need to understand how to use it for our own benefits. There are different levels here that we can touch upon. One is the, let's say, more institutional and more regulatory one. And I know that more than 130 nations have literally just adopted an ethical code for AI adoption. I mean, at the center of this, there is that in the end, people must remain in control at a certain level in the decision-making process for artificial intelligence. That's a key issue. I mean, I want to give just, maybe not general point, something more specific in terms of skills. Artificial intelligence will be important, incredibly important, but it requires and will change business models. Of course, jobs will go. That's the name of the game. Other jobs will be created, and I'm not an economist, I'm a strategist, so I will speak at the strategy level. At the strategy level, what is going to be very important for policymakers is to, and for institutional, for academic institutions and for consulting companies and for business, is to create capabilities that are intrinsically more blurred. What artificial intelligence does, often it connects different knowledge domains. And in order to probe, so for example, marketing and operations, or pharma and insurance, financial services and pharmaceutical. And actually I have a very recent paper in which I show that there is blurring, for example, between the pharmaceutical and financial services. So these industries, because of the adoption of artificial intelligence, are becoming more blurred, more similar. It's more difficult to distinguish them from one another than 15, 20 years ago. I mean, this is just a very recent piece of research that I'm presenting now. Now, what does it mean for this audience? For this audience means that one skill that will be very much in demand for the future for effective and efficient and ethical use of artificial intelligence is people that are able to connect different knowledge domains, pharma and financial services, operations and marketing. Now, this is pretty difficult to build. This skill is incredibly difficult to build because we were used to speak and to learn and to consult in silos. McKinsey is top management consulting. UBS is investment banking, private banking for a very specific part of the very specific segment. Now, we will need more blurring in terms of skills. And how do we train people that can blur, can understand marketing operations, pharma, and insurance? So when they are put in front of the outcome of artificial intelligence decision, can actually probe this outcome. That's a massive challenge, and think about this challenge has to be addressed at scale, because artificial intelligence is all about scale. It's all about, being fast. So to answer your question with one answer, I would say, it's not for me now to decide whether good or bad. All you said is going to happen. Now, how do we bend artificial intelligence in our favor is by, many things, but one thing at the firm level that I would like to point out is creating capabilities that are able to integrate knowledge domains so they can probe more efficiently and effectively artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. Mr. Castelli, would you like to express?
Yes, before I do that, I just want to for a moment echo what Professor Kolodko said. I share with you the rationality which should drive a decision about globalization, and however you look globalization, it has been the most powerful wealth creation policy ever implemented, I believe, in human history, if you think about the number of people involved globally. But I think in the end, I can also see a scenario where globalization is in some way heated. And I think the two main factors which will decide whether we remain into a globalized world or we see some reversal, not all of it, of course. I think it will be, first of all, to what extent the economic recovery post the pandemic will be strong enough to really lift quite a big chunk of the population in our countries out of the level where they've been now, or they've been falling over the last few years, because that's what determined in the end the backlash against globalization before the pandemic. And second, of course, is politics, because I agree with you. Trump, the problem is that there can be another Trump being elected in the future somewhere or in a major country around the world. And so we cannot rule it out, but I share the same optimism of the professor. On the question of artificial intelligence and digitization, I think that my previous speaker said very clearly. First of all, I could mention by mentioning an historical type of parallel. If you remember the Luddite movement, when the textile industry was hit by technological development, we always had a strong backlash against a new technology because they have been perceived as taking away control to human or to take away jobs. So I'm not surprised that also in the digital world, on digitization, we are seeing the same backlash. But let me answer with, which is exactly in line with what has been said, with one example. You might remember that a while ago, in the financial service industry, they've been launched the so-called robo-advisor. So the idea was that a robo-advisor would replace people like me in talking to an investor who might be wants to decide where to invest his pension. Robo-advisor never succeed. They didn't replace people like me. I should be happy about that because I still have a job. But at the same time, what it shows is that there has been an evolution. And the evolution has actually been in integrating the digital tools with the human factor. And that's exactly what I think financial institutions are trying to do. And the professor is absolutely right. Creating a digital ecosystem where the counterparty of our business can come and enrich themselves and receive a much more tailored and advice and exactly the right products which really meets their needs. That's what the digital tool will do, and artificial intelligence is part of that. And I believe that that is going to be, and I think this trend is irreversible, and I don't think the opposition from some parts of the world will eventually stop these trends. I think it should be embraced and governed.
Thank you very much. I appreciate for your extensive response. And by that, I would like to appreciate for all of our guests who participate at this panel. And I also express our appreciation for both of you, Mr. Professor Lanzolo and Mr. Castelli. Thank you very much. That's the end of the first panel of today. Thank you very much, our guests, for being with us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice continuation of your conference. Bye-bye.
Təşəkkür edirik. Birinci panel müzakirələri başa çatdı. İndi isə panel iştirakçılarının təltif edilməsi üçün forumun sədri, UNEC-in rektoru Professor Ədalət Muradovu dəvət edirik. Buyurun Ədalət müəllim. Beləliklə, Neyman Muradlı, Azərbaycan Dövlət İqtisadi Universitetinin prorektoru. Alqışlarınızı rica edirik. Grzegorz Kalotka, Kazimiyinski Üniversitesi'nin profesörü. Alqışlarınız. Yermolay Solzhenitsyn, McKinsey & Company'nin Moskvadakı baş tərəfdaşı. Alqışlarınız. Alqışlarınızı rica edək. Təşəkkür edirik, hörmətli görüş iştirakçıları. Forumun birinci panelinin artıq yekunlaşdırdıq. Təşəkkür edirik, çox sağ olun. Hörmətli Neyman Muradlıya, Massimiliano Castelli'ye, Gianvito Lanzolo'ya, Grzegorz Kalotka'ya və Yermolay Solzhenitsyn'ə iştiraka görə təşəkkür edirik bir daha. Çox sağ olun. UNEC, bəli. Tamamdır. Təşəkkür edirik, çox sağ olun. Alqışlarınız. Bəli, birinci panel müzakirəmiz başa çatdı. UNEC və Türkiyə Cumhuriyyəti Çalışma və Sosial Güvənlik Bakanlığı arasında iki tərəfli müqavilənin imzalanması başlayacaq birazdan. Protokol dəvətlilərimizi birinci mərtəbədəki konferans zalında həmin mərasimdə iştirak etməyə dəvət edirik. Hörmətli forum iştirakçıları, onu da qeyd edim ki, 3 gün davam edəcək forumda olan bütün panelləri və görüşləri UNEC sosial şəbəkə hesablarından canlı yayım vasitəsilə izləyə bilərsiniz.